Cursor announced they're at $500 million of ARR. Lovable has gone $0 to $60 million of ARR in the last 2 quarters. GitHub Copilot, $400 million of ARR. There really is no plateau in sight for innovation. You might miss something spectacular and industry shifting.
Welcome to the Matt Podcast. I'm Matt Turck from FirstMark. Today, we're doing something a little different. My FirstMark colleague, David Waltcher, and I sit down to unpack one of the key trends of the year, the rise of AI coding. We talk about key startups in the space, draw some lessons from history, and think through second-order effects on the rest of the ecosystem.
With every surge in production, there's just a cleanup crew that naturally comes and a new market and industry that follows in its wake.
If thanks to AI, everyone can now be a developer, then what does that mean for software, the role of the CTO, as well as the broad tech industry going forward?
For CTOs, this is going to be sort of a hallmark moment for them over the next 5 years or so, where they have a lot of important decisions to make across talent, architecture, team structure, governance, principles, security.
And what opportunities and challenges does that create for engineers, founders, and investors?
All of the problems that I'm talking about are very much our opportunities as investors and founders, and we see a ton of them across all of these spaces. I'll call out a few.
This is a VC lens on one of the biggest stories of the year and very relevant for anyone trying to make sense of the ever-changing AI landscape. All right, David, excited to do this. Today we're going to talk about a really hot topic, the impact of AI on engineering. So it's a little bit of a different format for this episode of the Matt Podcast. We have a presentation. We're going to go through it and talk about it together. So I'll let you drive and get started.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me on. So quick context, I was asked to pull this presentation together for the CTO summit that we threw last week. You know, I would say it is one of the most interesting times in engineering and this broader ecosystem of technology. And so maybe I'll just kick off the presentation with talking about a quick summary of how we've arrived at this generative AI moment in our engineering ecosystem by just giving a quick highlight of, call it the 6 trends or so that have demarked the last 2 decades in the world of developers. So I'll start with pre-cloud, when we used to just deploy code directly onto servers.
AKA prehistoric times.
Correct. And then around, call it 2010, along with cloud, DevOps finally got coined, which was really the merging of dev and operations into this whole subsequent tool set and set of workflows that emerged around it, like Git, CI/CD, et cetera, that we all know today. And that very much spurred this generation of SaaS explosion. All of the small, mid, large cap companies today that we think of as being venture-backed very much belong in that category of company. And then 2 sort of things between then and now that I think are worth noting. One is the proliferation of APIs, which essentially gave all of those SaaS applications the ability to very quickly expand their capabilities by almost outsourcing things like payments and messaging and search to companies like Stripe and Algolia and MessageBird. And then 2 is abstraction. So you think about companies like HashiCorp and Sneak and DBT and Vercel, very much catering to an audience of developers who are using code interfaces to all of a sudden do things that historically have been very much outside the purview of developer workflows. And so think about infrastructure provisioning with Terraform, or think about DBT when all of a sudden we're now data engineering through a code interface. And over that time, so from call it 2006 all the way to now, estimated about 7x growth in the number of global software developers, which I think of as sort of an index to this tech ecosystem. And that's where we've arrived today. So generative AI, this massive shift in delivery model, in the way that developers work, and one that I, in this presentation really talk about being probably the most impactful thing on this page.
It's interesting to think about why coding and development has been such a major success in generative AI. When people talk about, okay, what generative AI applications have been successful so far, coding seems to be number one by far. There is something about code that lends itself particularly well to AI. First of all, because there's tons of training data out there. So GitHub has been a godsend for AI training, because so much of GitHub is public, so publicly available repositories. We're talking about hundreds of millions of repositories on GitHub. To the the coding language, by definition, is highly structured and very precise. It's a grammar that you have to get right for the machine to work. And then 3, it operates through patterns, which lend themselves well to AI training. And then 4, there's a very clear ROI to all the things. People spend a lot of time doing grunt work around coding. So like anything that enables them to automate the work is incredibly impactful.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. The first point you made is really interesting, which is this corpus of open source code that all of these models could use as training data, which is very much true. And actually, I think later in the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about some of the bad or somewhat negative effects of that corpus of data that those models have been trained on and how that's created specifically security concerns. The empirical nature of code has certainly made it a great early use case for AI. And then the last thing I'd say is just developers have always been the type of persona that loves to try new things. And so as a buyer and a user, they always made a ton of sense for AI. And obviously, across the broader world of consumers, it's been well documented that ChatGPT has made its way into millions of people's hands. So it's not to say that AI is not a mass market phenomenon already, but I think from an enterprise perspective, they've just been a great buyer for tools like this, and the results have been very much measurable.
Yeah. And that's a really interesting thought in that in some ways, generative AI has accelerated a behavior that already existed, meaning that developers have been using Stack Overflow for many years. So the idea of using somebody else's code or pre-existing code, copying and pasting, is not a new behavior versus a lot of other things that people outside of coding need to do with generative AI, which is figure out how to use those things. Like in many ways, it's leveraging an existing behavior, and also the concept of having code completion in the IDE is not new either. I believe IntelliSense was created in 96 or something like that by Microsoft, which was already a automatic code completion. So that may be another reason why adoption has been so dramatically fast.
Yeah, absolutely. And so maybe to kind of exemplify a lot of what we've been talking about, we're about 24 months into this wave, give or take. It's changed a ton of behavior. It's taken our community by storm, but it's also just created a ton of really, really interesting special companies that have grown especially quickly. And so Cursor, maybe 3 weeks ago, announced they're at $500 million of ARR.
Is that actually the fastest growing company of all time, maybe in B2B? I
believe so. Lovable, which allows people to create prototypes and web apps through a series of prompts, has gone $0 to $60 million of ARR in the last 2 quarters. GitHub Copilot, which I know you just had Thomas on the podcast not too long ago, $400 million of ARR, 15 million developers, very much the steward of this category, first mover.
Yeah, exactly. The interesting thing that Thomas highlighted, among many other things, and is really an episode worth listening to, was how they actually were thinking about AI when GitHub was acquired in 2018.
Yeah.
So it's not just that they released Copilot a full year before the whole ChatGPT craze, but they had been thinking about it way ahead of time. I thought that was really interesting. And yeah, Copilot came out in 2021, running on Codex, which was the first coding model by OpenAI, which came out in 2021, I think, which was basically based on GPT-3 at the time.
And recently has had a large resurgence in a new form. A couple other examples. So V0, again, you just had Guillermo on the podcast. This is Vercel's.
Another great episode. Sorry, I'll stop shilling the podcast on the podcast, but that was phenomenal. He's such an incredible founder.
Windsurf, which is rumored to have sold to OpenAI, hit $100 million of ARR quite recently. And then Replit, which went from $10 to $100 million of ARR in just the last 6 months.
Yeah. After being at it for a solid 10 plus years. So I also had Amjad on the podcast. I promise I'll stop now. But that was another great episode. Is such a incredibly thoughtful guy. And yeah, I mean, the story of Replit was that it was, from what I understand as an outsider, not an investor, pretty flat for many, many years with a little bit of a kind of like hobbyist student kind of user base. And when they launched their agent a few months ago, it's been, well, what you see on the screen here, this just dramatic acceleration. Such a wonderful story.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Historically, they were known for being very much in the hobbyist indie developer educational setting. And what's interesting is actually that is the setting where people are now growing up in an AI native way from an engineering standpoint. And so in many ways, like doubling down and betting on that distribution channel over the long run has actually probably created the moment that they're having.
Well said.
So anyways, point is just to say, like, this is a very special group of companies that is ramping quickly and has no sign of stopping. And there really is no plateau in sight for innovation. I mean, it's just, for all of your listeners who spend their time on Twitter and TechCrunch and VentureBeat every day, it can feel quite overwhelming.
Which is something that we as VCs certainly do not do.
Never. My argument in this presentation really is that behind all of the marketing gloss, there really is more substance than there ever has been before. And if you, I hate to say this, but if you go offline and you aren't keeping up with the updates for a week at a time, you really might miss something spectacular and industry shifting. And so far, we've seen really remarkable, tangible results across our network of engineering organizations. So hopefully this can just put some numbers to, at an organizational level, how code generation is really changing engineering process. We've seen a 30 to 50% faster throughput. We've seen 12% increase in PR merges. This is a really important compounding stat here on the bottom left, which is a 17% increase in the amount of time folks are spending on roadmap versus maintenance and keeping the lights on and support. And then in my mind, most impressively, 82% of people we've spoken to are already using AI to write code. And so that is just, again, an adoption curve that is pretty much unprecedented. And I think, we can talk more about why that is, but I think predominantly it lends itself, again, to the audience and the arena of distribution, IDEs, where people live today. These aren't net new interfaces for the most part, very much embedded in people's style of working. And again, with very similar distribution mechanisms and keystrokes and delivery models. And so it's just been a fascinating couple years.
On that note of people using AI, I guess there's another topic we could cover, but we got to pick, we could talk about this for hours, so we got to pick what we discuss. But then there's that whole discussion of autonomous agents versus more of a sort of coding copilot. And I think it's more shades of gray in between now. It used to be a little bit of a starker kind of distinction not that long ago. Now it looks like the copilots are starting to be agentic in many ways. But still, there's like this really interesting question in the industry where for the cursors and the lovable, on one hand, you have companies like Devon trying to build fully autonomous agents that basically go away and come back with a fully baked product, and which by all accounts doesn't seem to be working yet, but that seems to be pointing to a future that is pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah, I would say today what we're seeing is this spectrum of people and use cases that vary by experience and complexity. And for now, many of the agentic solutions that are truly end-to-end, complete something, are very much being pointed at lower level tasks that I'd say are quote unquote more mindless, that have less dependency, complexity, that have less of a need for context and knowledge. And that's worked very well. So yeah, there really is a diverse array of ways that you can apply AI to this problem. And I think many of the best organizations and engineering leaders I talk to deploy all sorts of things across their stack, depending again on the use case and the people. I would say, despite all of these amazing numbers and stats, I want to pose sort of a historical analogy here to draw to this space, basically to say that with production surges, it tends to be the case that actually a lot of problems emerge, and in their wake, markets follow. Or maybe a punchier way to say that would be, with every surge in production, there's just a cleanup crew that naturally comes and a new market and industry that follows in its wake. Yeah, so if you'll allow me, we're going to go back in time as far back as the 15th century and talk about a couple examples where we've seen this happen and how we might be able to draw some analogies to today.
All right, let's do it.
So starting with the Gutenberg press, this really was the advent of our ability to print books at scale. And so in the 1440s in Europe, we went from about 40 to 3.6K pages being printed per day. I think over the next 60 years or so, there were 20 million books in circulation in Europe, up from 3,000. And so
big disruption, right? It put monks out of business.
Yeah.
The people that spend their entire lives copying by hand.
Yes, they turned to making chartreuse. So anyways, this sounds like a great thing, right? I would hope we all love books. But actually, like many of the content issues that we see today, there were a lot of challenges that emerged, namely misinformation, mass reproduced quality issues, a bunch of informational overload. And so we saw a bunch of new industries emerge in the wake of the press, which were all the things that we think about when we think about books, the printing, publishing houses, editors, libraries now for consumers to deal with the abundance of options that they have, almost serving as physical indexes of the many books that they could access. And then a bunch of regulation that came around licensing and censorship. And again, all the things that we associate with content today. Another example, almost 500 years later, was the Ford assembly line. So in the early 1900s, Henry Ford invented the first continuously moving assembly line, and we dropped the time per car assembly-wise by almost 90%. And so over the next 20 or so years, the output of Model Ts soared to about 10 million in the US. And we went from a society that was mostly horse and carriage, railroad, and trolley driven to all of a sudden being a car country. So we still have car challenges today, but if you can imagine then, they felt much more extreme. Things like infrastructure strain, safety issues, the need to build all of the roads and infrastructure to support this new economy, factory workers' rights, environmental issues. And so again, we saw these industries emerge. I'll highlight the ones that feel very much endemic to auto. So quality inspectors, mechanics, dealerships, gas station attendants. And then on the regulation side, all of the licensing, our driver's licenses, our license plates, traffic police. And again, all of the build out over the following 50 years or so of the freeways, highways, roads that we all use and drive on today. And so, there are a bunch of other examples of this in history. I sort of arbitrarily chose those two, but railroads, map making, the postal system. I think smartphones is probably the most recent example where all of a sudden we have tons of compute in our hand and the ability to take as many pictures as we'd like in a day. And in its wake, you've seen a ton of industry emerge, mostly social media, influencer marketing, et cetera. And then all of the regulation around privacy and biometrics that still feels very top of mind today, and that has been evolving over the last decade or so. And so again, I would just posit, as production surges, you see all of these problems come in the wake of that production, and then new industries come around. And so we didn't bury the lead here. If you think about code, I would argue we're very much seeing a similar trend where on the canonical DevOps cycle diagram, you're seeing code commit just accelerate so much. And today, at least, many of the processes that are downstream of that, our CI/CD pipelines, our testing suites, our build infrastructure, the way that we think about observability and monitoring has very much stayed the same, but it's kind of breaking. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, what happens next, on yet another episode of the Mad Podcast, a couple of weeks ago, we had Brendan Humphreys, CTO of Canva, who was talking about that exactly, which is okay. It's great that you can create code, but like we had one guy who submitted a PR that was 50,000 lines, and they have a peer review culture, and they basically had to make the point that it was not okay to just lob over the fence 50,000 lines, and now good luck, somebody's got to review it. More code. Now what?
To put some numbers to how these pressure points are starting to begin to explode, we're just seeing a lot more time spent debugging. We're seeing a ton more security vulnerabilities, which we alluded to a little bit earlier when we were talking about how these models have actually been built and on what data. We're seeing a ton of performance issues emerge as a result. And, I know you did your podcast with Guillermo. I actually did an event with Malte Ubel, who's the CTO at Vercel. And
and that event is on our guild. Since this is turning out to be a shilling episode, we can shill the FirstMark Guild. So guilds is the name for our private communities that we have at FirstMark, where we have a bunch of people on a per job basis from the portfolio, but also from outside of the portfolio. And this specific event was from our CTO guild, and so you ran a sort of intimate fireside chat with the CTO of Vercel, just for context.
So this was a great event for our CTO guild, and Malte, among many interesting things, I think one of the most fascinating things that he said was that most of his great engineers who have been with the company for a while, as they've dog-fed, V0, and they've used things like Cursor and Windsurf in-house, is that many of his great engineers are actually becoming predominantly professional code reviewers. And this notion that as AI code gen has just totally increased the rate at which they're producing and outputting code commits, you need people who almost act as, people sitting in a toll booth letting cars pass or not pass, very much doing the same thing with code, but people in those seats that have great taste and know what bad or good or great looks like. And so I thought that was sort of the tip of the iceberg as you think about you have these large engineering organizations that have all been trained somewhat similarly on how they should all think about working together and what sorts of jobs that certain people should be doing and not doing and how teams should work together. And we've seen this really, really fast shift where individual ICs who used to be, green dots everywhere on their GitHub repo are all of a sudden becoming code reviewers. And so, I thought that was a really interesting analogy, and I'll expand more on it. But
that's fascinating, right? So you used to have front-end engineers and back-end engineers and full-stack people, and there might be a future where people are none of that and just everybody's a code reviewer, which opens up this whole conversation about how do you become a good engineer in the future in this new age of AI, and how people should be trained and all the things. But let's keep going.
We did a study at FirstMark across, I think it was a little over 300 engineering organizations, and we asked them just sentiment basically on code gen and how it's made them feel about certain metrics that they use to measure their engineering output.
Yeah, so let's go through some of this, including for people that may be listening to this in a podcast-only version. So what are some of the metrics and numbers we have here?
Yeah, so I would say everything in purple, unsurprisingly, which is positive, is very much linked to speed and efficiency and velocity. And so most of these stats are measuring on some way or in some way or another time. Mm-hmm. Time spent to develop something, the number of times in a certain period that we commit, how often we're deploying. And so all of those things have been very much sped up in this age of AI. But what's interesting is many of those things don't take into account like what happens afterwards. And so again, we could make as many commits as we want, but that's very much just the first step in the DevOps process as it exists today. In blue are most of the sort of negatively impacted areas across the survey that we did, which are mostly reliability and process oriented. And so like take mean time to restore, for example. If something goes down, how long does it take to restore it? Well, all of a sudden, if we don't have provenance over the piece of code that's relevant to something that happened, an incident, it's much harder for us to go back and say, oh, actually, there was a bug over there. And so that's been what's generally interesting. I think this slide really just goes to say, again, everybody's getting sped up. The amount of commits is skyrocketing. But all the stuff that we measure when we think about efficiency and all the downstream things that we want to happen post-code commit seem to be faltering.
Yeah, I love it. It re-anchors the reality of, it's cool to have AI, but now what does that mean, right?
Yeah, so I can be a little more specific here in terms of what's breaking.
Yeah, let's do it.
We can start with security. Put simply, we're just seeing more security vulnerabilities than ever before.
Mm-hmm. And new types of security vulnerability.
Yes, I would say new types of security vulnerabilities, especially given, and this is sort of separate from the conversation about coding, but given deepfakes and all the stuff that's happening in the arena of email right now, certainly on that side, and then also in the world of code gen, to our earlier conversation, many of these models have been trained on really large bodies of open source code, and many of those pieces of code just share vulnerabilities and bugs that you can't see coming in the same way because again, you're not operating with the same level of decisiveness and meticulousness. And so as a result, you're seeing things like CI/CD pipelines and build systems completely breaking. We're seeing, I mean, folks have had brittle CI/CD pipelines for a while now. We've seen a lot of companies emerge over the last decade to sort of ameliorate that and change the way that we think about CI and CD, but the flake rate is just much higher. And that's true of testing too. So flakes basically is just your ability to either trust or not trust a pass-fail result. And if you have a flake, it essentially means something passed and then it failed, but the inputs were the same. And so we're just seeing like flakiness generally across code skyrocketing. I would say build has come under a lot of duress. It's just much harder to cache code, which a lot of build tools try to do when code gen is relatively stochastic. And so again, like the notion that given the same set of inputs or similar inputs, you're just not going to get the same set of outputs. And then QA and code review are areas that we've talked about, but we've seen QA processes just completely overwhelmed. And on the code review side, we're just seeing a new focus on code review that is pretty unrelenting, that I'd say has gone from a step in a process to very much a job in and of itself.
Yeah, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it, but obviously the question is, to which extent can AI review AI?
Unfortunately, for those people that are viewing the podcast that are engineers or practitioners, all of the problems that I'm talking about are very much our opportunities as investors.
And founders.
And we see a ton of them across all of these spaces. So I won't go into every single one, but I'll call out a few. On the security side, so there's a lot of companies, older companies, Fortune 1000 companies that use EOL software. So maybe they're on like a very old version of CentOS, or maybe they're using a old version of an open source library, and the notion that they could just upgrade is actually quite. It's a difficult thing to do. And so we're seeing a handful of companies that have actually pioneered what's called auto patching. And so the ability just to, instead of like forcing folks to make a potentially breaking change, just patch a project and let things stay status quo and smooth. That's a capability that you'd be shocked. There are thousands of engineers that have spent days, weeks, months trying to just keep something afloat.
Yeah,
because of an old dependency or an old package.
That sounds brittle.
Yeah. Across, I'll say QA, we're seeing a lot of interesting agentic solutions that are reasoning based on essentially semantic requirements. Better to almost tell the solution what the solution needs to be than to try to do any sort of like diff analysis or anything else that, again, given the stochasticism of AI, actually might take you down a dark place. And then in code review, we're just seeing a lot of tools that are getting really fast adoption that are doing essentially agentic first pass checks for code. So yeah, the space is moving quickly, and I would imagine if we did another check-in in 6 months, we'd probably be talking about a whole new slew of problems, but also a bunch of solutions that have addressed many of the things that we've talked about today. It's moving fast.
Yeah, it's fascinating, like to think about all of this as a system where everything is interdependent, and this keeps on shifting.
I'll use this a bit to shine some light on a handful of the companies across these different categories.
We VC, so we have to do a little landscape and put logos in categories.
Correct.
This is what we do best.
We'll find a better name for this at some point. The AI
landscape. The mad landscape.
You just throw this in the mad landscape, right? It's been fascinating, and maybe I'll use this slide just to say this is one small sliver of the total companies in this market. And again, back to the point about us being on Twitter and reading blogs and news articles, there are probably a dozen companies that come out every day that sit in this space. And so it's made this job both exhilarating and fun to spend time in this category.
It makes things harder on the company side because there's so much noise. You need to just power your way through noise, and for people to start noticing you, the bar is higher. So hype in the a red hot market comes with pros and cons.
Yeah, and then most interestingly, I would say we've talked mostly about engineers themselves, but I think for CTOs, this is going to be sort of a hallmark moment for them over the next 5 years or so, where they have a lot of important decisions to make across talent, architecture, team structure, governance, principles, security. I wanted to take the opportunity, especially given we were talking to a room of CTOs, just to sort of talk through those things and see what's different. So I'll start with hiring, and I'll share an anecdote that I had read recently, which is that computer science grads are actually among the top 5 or 6 majors graduating from college right now with the highest unemployment rate, which is, I mean, it is shocking. And I think it speaks in many ways to the fact that despite that there's a huge demand for software engineering as a concept, the people who are trained in that practice are actually not in high demand. And so, I very much think, whereas we used to focus on hiring these canonical 10x engineers and developers who can write code, we're seeing CTOs very much focused on hiring great editors and reviewers and prompt engineers who can almost shape and validate and curate that AI-generated output.
The CTO of Canva was saying that while this is not the only reason that paused on the hiring for a bit, in part to figure out what to do. As we alluded to earlier, then the question becomes, how do you become a great editor or QA person if you don't write the code and build fundamental knowledge and habits around the core? How do you build the taste that you need to be able to review those things? It's a complicated topic.
The idea of prompting too is just fascinating. So I was having an interesting conversation with an engineer the other day who was talking about, the ability to one-shot Salesforce. And by one-shot, they mean like, could I recreate Salesforce with in just one sitting with one of these tools? I mean, obviously the answer is no. But if you do ask why, it's mostly because actually, like, if you're trying to recreate something through a series of prompts, you actually have to really understand what it is that you're creating. And most of us, when we do that, we're starting visually. We think we understand, maybe the database logic sitting underneath an app. But I mean, Salesforce is a fantastic example of a very, very complex, deep app with a ton of different use cases and integrations and reporting structures. And so, it's not just the reviewing side, I think, that will evolve, but it's also just how we think about prompting and that being a skill set. So that is fascinating. I think on the architecture side too, we're seeing a similarly sized shift where, we used to sort of define these systems via design docs and then a bunch of human enforced conventions that might have sat in a Confluence doc somewhere to follow. Whereas today we're seeing just this huge push to define systems in a very machine enforceable way, where you're almost setting these IAC-esque guardrails that AI can just conform to and see and know in a way that is much more stress-free for a CTO who's putting, let's say, like 10 Devon engineers to work. So that is also an equally large shift. We alluded to this too. I'd say the third thing is team structure. So we used to your point about front-end engineers and back-end engineers, we used to just organize teams in a very structured way. And one of the fascinating things I think that's come out of AI, generally speaking, is we're just seeing companies and teams being able to do a lot more with a lot less. And I think that's especially true in the engineer context, which, again, speaks to this college grad stat. But we're seeing smaller teams where some people just review and manage AI written code, and that's very much okay. And it spans from front end to back end to systems and everything in between.
There is the whole question of what happens as you start getting product people to create code, functioning applications, and how does that fit? If everybody's a coder, this change of persona within the enterprise of like who actually produces code and the fact that it can, in theory, be everyone, what does that mean?
Yeah, historically, EPD, engineering product design, has been a super complicated hierarchy system in companies where you have a ton of different handoffs between engineers and designers and product people, and company to company, it always looked very different, whether, product people interface directly with engineers at all, whether they were really there to ideate and then hand off entirely. And so to your point, as like the technical barrier to create something has dropped, it is straining and changing the way that those teams operate together quite a bit. And your story from Canva is exactly right. Like this notion that we would do like a peer review of that much code. There needs to be a change in the way that folks think about governance, and this culture of reviews in general is changing very quickly. And so,
by the way, to close the loop on that story, I think the punchline was that the CTO reinforced the fact that every pull review needs to be a few hundred lines. Not thousands, certainly not tens of thousands, but that was the outcome. So like, do whatever you want with AI, but like whatever you pull over the fence needs to be a few hundred lines.
Yeah, enforcing constraints.
Yes.
A big thing we've seen come out of this is this notion of provenance, which is, in layman's terms, essentially the lineage of code. So who owns it? What are the dependencies? Where did it come from? And increasingly, again, with just the amount of volume that we're seeing across code in general, and then the new sort of sources of code that aren't coming from like specific human identities in an organization, this notion of provenance has actually been pushed to its outer limit and remains from a governance standpoint and for a bunch of downstream processes just super important. The last two things I'll talk about are velocity and security. So on velocity, a lot of engineering folks have historically talked about eliminating bottlenecks. And so it could be any number of things that cause a bottleneck in that entire DevOps flow. Whereas now, very much there's a focus on containing this idea of entropy and then managing, from a governance standpoint, the coherence of AI systems to system architecture. That's been another really interesting theme where you have these broad-based products that are being used by everyone, but everyone's stack looks very different. And how can you conform and give context to an AI product, especially in this world, for what it is that the constraints need to look like. And so we've seen from a velocity standpoint, these notions of entropy and coherence just much more important today than they were, 2 years ago. And then we've talked about security, but I think we'll see a lot of things that come out of this space that look very much like products that are actually catching bugs and problems at the time of write. And that will be a very interesting shift in the ASPM world. So yeah, maybe to bring it full circle, again, to this analogy about productivity surges and booms, we see a ton of challenges that come from those historically, and we see new industries come in the wake of those challenges. And I think we're very much, for now, seeing that in CodeGen. And so, I'm as excited as I've ever been to be an investor in this space. I think it's rare to see problems happening as fast as the companies that are solving those problems grow. Everything is just moving so fast. And so, again, I think in 6 months' time, maybe we'll get back together and this will look either like something that's been completely solved or something where the problems have shifted in form factor completely. But it's been fascinating.
And it also feels like a lot of those companies that are doing incredibly well, to some extent, are also an experiment in the making, meaning that there are, from what we hear, a lot of unsolved issues in these companies. One is retention. There's a lot of use cases around prototyping and creating new things, but time will tell whether that sticks. Like as an industry, we don't know yet. And there's reportedly open questions around gross margins as well, which means that on a unit basis, a lot of those companies operate at a loss. The more they serve customers, the more they lose money, which I think the industry obviously collectively hopes is just a moment in time that's related to a certain cost structure and then disappears at scale. But it's not for the faint-hearted.
Yeah, look, like many spaces in AI at the application layer, many of these products started out with what I would say are very simple delivery models of technology that wasn't quite their own, with really smart distribution strategies. And I mean, in many ways, I think the IDE companies are pushing the outer limits of what zero switching costs could really look like. But what's interesting is now they all have a war chest of money, of usage, of talent, and they are going after much harder problems that are very much differentiated and proprietary. And so, it will be fascinating to see how the space changes over time. But I would say the parameters within which we've operated thus far have been very much unique, right? We're talking about forking VS Code, which is what
Cursor did.
That is not something that I would have seen coming if you had asked me in 2018 to imagine what generative AI would look like, right? But that has been thus far the most impressive business that's been built in this space, and they've done a phenomenal job.
So what do we think that means for founders in the space? Do we think there's more opportunity, less opportunity? It's more complicated or clearer now? In particular, vis-a-vis what the large companies are doing, because certainly Microsoft has been making big moves, but Google has a bunch of products in the space, and there seems to be one more competitor somewhere every day. You were mentioning the pace of innovation. I think a couple of weeks ago, Mistral came up with their own code product, which was a combination of several pieces that they had before. But there's so many companies in the space. So is that a good space if you're thinking of starting a company, or has the alpha largely left the room?
I think it's always incredibly easy to say the alpha's left the room, especially if you're the person who wants to start a company and you don't know where to begin. Again, we talk about being overwhelmed by headlines. I couldn't imagine being a founder without an idea right now, because at once there's a million things to go build, and on the other hand, there's also probably a million people trying to do it. Look, I think you'll get very different perspectives on this. Developers have always been a very opinionated, picky buyer, and that's created a lot of opportunity for a lot of different companies that start with very specific frameworks or ways of doing a certain task or a delivery model, and they get uptake if they are right, at least among a subset of people. And so I think it's rare, and GitHub is a great counterexample of this, which is it's almost like a consumer top 1,000 Alexa domain. It's probably much higher than 1,000, but in general, it's rare that you see ubiquity, is what I'm trying to say in the world of developers. So I still believe just on that alone, there's a ton of opportunity left to go build something really interesting. And then two, I would say, again, it's a market that's young, fast, but also huge. And to everything I've talked about in this presentation, a lot of the early opportunity, you could say the alpha is gone, so to speak. But all of the companies that have absorbed that and captured that have been moving at such breakneck speed that there's just a ton of derivative stuff to go do now. Yeah. And so, it would be like saying, well, AWS, Azure, and GCP came around and they ate up the whole cloud opportunity. So I guess there's no more money in cloud anymore. Of course, that wasn't the case, right? It just meant that there were going to be all these new things that we needed around the ability to be cloud-based. And I mean, we could talk for hours about what those things were, but I think loosely that analogy holds, where we have a new way of writing code, and there are going to be a lot of products that exist to serve the new needs that come along with that.
And certainly, there's been a halo effect to those incredibly fast-growing products that have served products that were part of their stack. So famously, Supabase and Neon on the database side have had a massive uptake based on the success of Cursor and Lovable. So there are strategies there for startups that are interesting. If you can get close to any of those products, there's some really sort of interesting derived velocity to gain.
And this is the magic of the Twitterverse and everything else. You see more reviews and love and hate for software tools in the B2B universe than you do sometimes for mass market consumer phenomenons. And so, to your point, the ability to become part of the de facto stack for building a company in this era, whether it's on the database side with a Postgres database like Supabase or Neon, or whether it's with the actual tool like Cursor that you're using to then write and deploy that code, that is a huge opportunity right now. And I think with this surge in people that are deciding to build something all at once, there is a good social proof element to what people want to be doing and what's been working and what's not. And I think that's we talk a lot here at FirstMark about what are the new ways that you can have advantages as a company, especially in a world where it's never been easier to build product. In many ways, it feels like we are at risk of being like a copycat world where you see some success online and then you go copy it the next day. But it feels like marketing and distribution and the ability to communicate directly one-to-one with your audience has never been more important. And a lot of the companies that we're talking about today do an exceptional job of that.
And it's probably true of all big platform shifts, but in this one, it's even more obvious than in prior ones. You can be a 1-year-old or 2-year-old company and actually be a lot more credible than a 5, 7, 10-year-old company, which may be 10x, 100x your size. But because you're part of that, platform shift, and you're like AI native, people take you more seriously than they do, which must be infuriating for the older companies that are just bigger and have products that work. But that tension between young companies with great demos on Twitter versus slightly older companies, we're not talking about companies that have been around for 100 years, is kind of amazing to watch.
So everybody wants to buy things that were bought by the most discerning people. And the notion of who is the most discerning person just seems to ping pong around and change over time. So to your point, most people will care, at least in our world, what the smartest buyer at Cursor thought about a given tool than what the smartest person at the 80 billion software business that IPO'd in 2012 might think.
Yep.
And even in my 10 or so years of investing, it's been wild to watch the shift almost socially of who are those companies that everybody is looking at for guidance on the right way to do things or the right tool to buy for a certain space. And you're 100% right. It's a very powerful thing to say some of these companies that we talked about today and many others are your customers or are your partners or are people that are willing to even put their name next to yours on an infographic. And so, it moves quickly and it changes often.
And by the way, taking a step back from an investor perspective, it's fascinating that those most successful companies in the AI, generative AI world would be developer tools because historically, at least for certain VCs, there was a little bit of a love-hate relationship to dev tools. Sometimes it was a hot category. Sometimes it was an unloved category. But, there was a perception that developers are difficult people. They're very hard to reach. They're cheap. They don't want to pay money. Therefore, it's hard to build big developer tool companies. And look, you could argue that between GitLab and Datadog and other companies, the proof was already in the pudding. But this is a sweet revenge for anyone that ever doubted developer tool as a category.
Yes, I think that that sentiment has been shared widely. What's interesting to think about too is just over time how the definition of developer tool has changed. And so take HashiCorp, for example. It's a tool that Terraform is a tool that very much developers use. Super successful outcome, recently sold to IBM for over $5 billion. I think it was $6-7 billion. And what's been interesting to watch and why I use that example is just, again, developers have been, while they have been cheap, so to speak, and picky and opinionated, their relative importance across organizations has seemed to just go up and to the right over the last decade or so. Their ability to make influential decisions on stack products, et cetera, really has seemed to change over time. And it's interesting to say that now, given now we're talking about maybe their skill set is less needed now more than ever. But I think developer tools in and of itself is sort of this loose category that very much used to be tools that developers use, and maybe that was limited to DevOps. And now it feels like it's tools that have either development implications or that have interfaces that developers use, whether or not they're for the development process. And that has yielded a much bigger set of companies. And so Stripe is a great example. Stripe is not a developer product in the typical sense. Historically, nobody has thought of payments as a developer problem, but the magic of what that company was that they were able to cater it to developers and made it really easy to use and adopt and play around with in a sandbox. And we all know how that story played out. And so I think, yes, while they've been a hard group to sell into, I think if you can do it right and kind of capture that taste and that feeling of capturing the moment, it has yielded some of the larger outcomes that we've seen across our world.
Wonderful. Well, that feels like a great place to leave it. David, thanks so much for doing this. This is fun. And indeed, the question is, in 6 months from now, when we do this again, as we should, will all of this be still true, partly true, will have completely changed in the context where stuff changes every week?
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for having me. It was a treat.
All right. Great. Thanks a lot. Hi, it's Matt Turck again. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Mad Podcast. If you enjoyed it, we'd be very grateful if you would consider subscribing if you haven't already, or leaving a positive review or comment on whichever platform you're watching this or listening to this episode from. This really helps us build a podcast and get great guests. Thanks, and see you at the next episode.